Have you ever wondered how hard you should be pushing your sets? Well, in this video, we're going to talk about repetitions in reserve, the pros, the cons, and who might benefit from using it. Repetitions in reserve is simply how many repetitions you have left until total muscular failure. A good range for this to have a stimulative working set is somewhere between 4 repetitions from failure and all the way to failure. The first pro of training short of failure or using repetitions in reserve is that each individual set is going to be less fatiguing. When each set is less fatiguing, it's going to let you accrue more mechanical volume over the course of the workout if you choose to do more sets over the course of the week, because it's going to allow you to, in that instance, do more sets as well and over the course of the month. We do know that volume is the key driver of muscle hypertrophy, and how much muscle you grow is likely dose dependent with volume. You get more effective reps with a higher load if you stay farther from failure. Next pro is going to be recovery. If in general your sets cause less total acute and accumulated fatigue and beat your muscles and joints up a little bit less, it's going to be a lot easier to recover from it. This means you could potentially train with higher weekly and monthly volumes, as previously mentioned, and potentially training with higher frequencies, which is yet another tool that allows you to pack on even more volume. If previously you could only train your chest on Monday because it was so beat up it wasn't recovered till Saturday, but you start training a little bit shy of failure, and now all of a sudden your chest is recovered by Wednesday, you could start hitting your chest on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, each of those sessions allowing you to get the same amount of sets you would have, but now you've added a third day. So let's say you went from 10 sets, now you went to 15 sets. So increased recovery and potentially increased frequency from that recovery. Pro number 3 of training shy of failure or repetitions in reserve is going to be that it's likely less psychologically taxing and draining. Some people love going into the gym and trying their absolute hardest, blood, sweat, tears, David Goggins style, and some don't. Some find the gym really taxing, it's hard to get motivated for it, and if all of your sets are to failure, blood, sweat, and tears, etc., this might burn some people out, whereas submaximal sets sometimes can be a little bit easier on the psyche and less mentally taxing over the course of the week. This makes repetitions and reserve training a very awesome candidate to use if you're a concurrent athlete or if you're lifting and playing a sport at the same time. The last large pro of repetition in reserve training is going to be it has a higher stimulus to fatigue ratio. So what do we mean by that? Each set that you would do for a muscle group has a certain amount of stimulus that's going to induce muscle growth, and it also has a fatigue cost from which you'll have to recover. Picking exercises that have high stimulus and low fatigue end up being the holy grail of muscle growth training. If you were to do a set and you were to leave 3 or 4 repetitions in reserve, you would get a good amount of the total hypertrophy available to you. And then if you were to jump this down to 2 repetitions in reserve, you would see it would start to be kind of a diminishing return. It's still a really big jump in the amount of muscle you'll grow, but it starts to be a diminishing return. Going from 2 reps all the way to 0 repetitions in reserve or total failure, there's very little muscle growth left on the table. This is what we call a diminishing return. And this line represents the fatigue cost of going closer and closer to failure. There's not really a good way to quantify this. It could just be linear, it could be additive or exponential, but the point stays the same. You're paying a much greater fatigue cost for a diminishing return on hypertrophy stimulus. This doesn't mean that failure training is useless. This just means that failure training is a very specific tool, whereas training on average 2 repetitions from failure is kind of the great middle zone for high stimulus to low fatigue. So now we'll get into some of the cons of repetition and reserve training. The first one is going to be that it's kind of hard to track, especially if you're a beginner. Tracking repetitions in reserve is a skill that even advanced athletes have to refine over time. You can do this by taking some weeks or sets in your mesocycle close to or at failure to see if you are accurately gauging your repetitions in reserve. The next con is that if you are the type of person that really likes the pain and the challenge of the gym, you use it as air quotes therapy, repetitions in reserve might seem boring for you. Certain muscle groups that have a hard time growing or certain people that have a hard time growing can be classed as low responders, and sometimes low responders need even more stimulus to grow. So low responders might not respond as well from training farther from failure. Lastly, let's talk about who should potentially use repetition in reserve training. Beginners. Now, I know this seems kind of paradoxical because I just said it's hard for them to track. However, beginners grow so well from so little stimulus, it doesn't actually matter if they get it wrong. They need to basically walk by a barbell and they're going to grow. Intermediate to advanced lifters can also benefit from this because it allows them to maximize their weekly, monthly, and yearly volume. Strength and power are skills that require you to lift a lot of load over time. So if you're constantly going to failure and you're having a lot of rep drop off, you're likely not going to be getting the best strength and power stimulus that you could be. Conversely, if you leave a little bit left in the tank, your reps can stay quite high and you're lifting a lot of load, really expressing that skill. Lastly, let's talk about what I recommend. If you're a beginner, I recommend keeping a stagnant repetitions in reserve, meaning most of your sets should probably fall around 2 repetitions in reserve. This is a great stimulus to fatigue ratio middle ground, and it's also somewhat easy to track. You don't have to think, do I have to change RIR? Do I have to change this? Carry the 9, Pythagorean theorem, what am I having for lunch? Why does Dr. Oz suck? If you're an intermediate or an advanced, or you're specifically trying to maximize muscle growth, I recommend a descending repetitions in reserve paradigm, meaning starting your mesocycle roughly around 3 repetitions in reserve, and then every week decreasing a repetition reserve. So you go 3 RIR, 2 RIR, 1 RIR, failure training, deload. How you get this relative increase in effort is likely going to be adding load to the exercises that it makes sense to, and adding reps to the repetitions or to the sets that it makes sense to. This ensures that you're getting a large hit of progressive overload every single week, and ensures that you're growing every single week. Hopefully this helped, and take your creatine.